Welcome to Aging Insight with your host, John Ross and Lisa Schollmeyer. This program is made possible by
Welcome to another edition of Aging Insight. I'm Lisa Schollmeyer, and I'm here with my co-host, John Ross. We are elder law attorneys based here in the Arklatex area. And, elder law attorneys, we are here to provide you with information about things about aging and paying for the cost of aging in place and the care that you might need. We want to talk about things like housing and the adjustments that need to be made as we get older. We also address some of the financial issues that come with aging, and finally the legal issues that you may come across as you get a little older. And so one of the big things that people are concerned about as they get older are dealing with their assets and what's going to happen with their assets, either at a point that they can no longer manage their assets, or that those assets need to be liquidated for care, or of course after they're deceased, what happens to assets then. But today, John, we want to talk about a very specific type of asset.
Yeah, when it comes to assets, and you think about it, you think about all of the different stuff that you own, and most of that, it doesn't really matter what your personal situation is, and when you die and you leave those assets to other people, it doesn't matter what their personal situation is. If you have a spoon, and you're perfectly competent, or you have Alzheimer's. You die and you pass that spoon down to your child, and your child is the best kid in the whole world or a convicted felon. It doesn't matter. You get to be in possession of your spoon, and so would your child when you pass away. The asset itself doesn't matter, but there are one little category of assets that those rules change a lot, and that is firearms.
That's right. In our local area, we certainly live in a sportsman's paradise, and I would guess that the vast majority of individuals and families in our area own and possess guns and firearms. And, it's really a part of our culture here. There's always a season open, deer season, rifle season, powder season. So many of our assets are tied up in the firearms area of assets. So that is a very ticky area of assets. And not only can value be tied up in firearms, but there's also, John, usually a lot of sentimental value.
Absolutely.
And a lot of folks in their firearms collections, because they may own, and they've had firearms passed down to them from a grandparent, that first deer hunting rifle, maybe a gun that was carried by a relative in the Korean War, something like that. So not only is there value tied up in those assets, there's a lot of sentiment tied up in those assets. So
yeah, that's right. And when it comes to gun ownership, unlike the ownership of just about any other asset, you have to meet a bunch of rules. You have to be over the age of 18 or 21, depending on the circumstances. You have to be competent, of sound mind. You can't be a convicted felon. You can't be under any sort of restraining order or have a conviction for domestic violence. There's lots of different things like this that impact a person's ability to own a firearm, and this is where you can start running into issues. So imagine you're a former military person, a former vet, and you might have a couple of hunting rifles around, maybe a handgun or something. You take the kids out hunting, and as you get older and it becomes harder and harder for you to care for yourself, all of a sudden you might need a little extra care. And Lisa, on the show in the past, we've talked about that there is a veterans benefit that can help pay for some of that care. Well, let me give you an example. I had a client recently, and this was a veteran, and he has Alzheimer's, and they need some extra care, and we were able to apply to the VA, and the VA came back and said, we agree that because of the Alzheimer's, this veteran cannot handle their own affairs, and because of that, we're going to start paying about $2,000 a month to help cover the costs of this veteran.
Yeah, which is a windfall that assists that family so much with the care of that veteran, but it comes with a string attached because of the veteran's level of competency.
Yeah, there's a little phrase in this, and it says, by the way, we don't feel like, because of the Alzheimer's, we don't feel like the veteran can handle their own affairs, and so we are proposing to declare that veteran unable to manage his own affairs. Which you say, okay, well, that makes sense.
Well,
if the veteran has Alzheimer's and can't, deal with money, well then the VA needs to know who's going to be in charge of this money, and so they need to declare the veteran incapacitated and appoint what they call a fiduciary or a representative. But then there's a little paragraph right below that, and it says, by the way, you need to know that if we declare you incompetent, you will be prohibited by federal law from being in possession of a firearm.
That's right, and I've had this come up with a family where I have I think he's about 96-year-old veteran that lives alone independently. His children are there every day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that kind of thing. And they were able to get this veterans benefit, but because of the handicaps this veteran now has, we got the letter that said, we'll give the money, but we'll declare the veteran incapacitated and he can't own a firearm. Now, his children thought that, this veteran was not going to have any of that. That, he kept an old .22 varmint rifle in the hall closet because, he lived out in the country and, there might be a varmint that he needs to scare off or to get out of the garden. And they were concerned that if they went into that hall closet to remove that varmint rifle, that there was going to be a problem.
Right. So you can get into this situation where your own personal disabilities as you get older may leave you unable to manage your own affairs. And this is where you get tied back. If you are, one of the requirements for being in possession of a firearm is that you must be legally competent. And if somebody gets a guardianship over you, if the VA or some other federal agency makes a declaration that you're unfit to manage your own affairs, and again, realize you probably won't know about this when it's happening, but something's got to be done with those firearms because it's now a crime for them to be in your possession. And not only could that get you in trouble, but it could even get other people in the household in trouble because they're allowing you to be in and around those firearms.
That's right.
So the first thing in all of this is planning for that future incapacity. What are you going to do with those guns if you're unable? And we're going to talk some more about solutions once we get done talking about all the problems. So stick around. We're going to take a break and we're going to keep talking about some of the issues related to firearms.
all our moments should be cherished. SEMA Hospice provides comfort care when you need it most with compassion, dignity, and respect. Along with Jordan Health Services, SEMA Hospice provides compassionate continuity of care. SEMA Hospice, comfort and care when it matters most.
The Oaks Independent are apartments for seniors who love secure, peace of mind, and consistency in their lives. Included in the price are cable, utilities, meals, weekly housekeeping, daily monitoring, and a medical alert device. All apartments wheelchair accessible, freestanding homes in a great part of town. Live in style, comfort, and accessibility. Live independent. Find us online or call today to schedule a tour. The Oaks Independent.
Hi there, I'm Larry Sims. It's been my privilege for the past several years to be a volunteer board member of Hospice of Texarkana, and there I'm able to represent community members like you. We continually customize our end-of-life care to better meet the needs of our community. As an example, our medical director and nurse practitioners still make visits to homes and facilities. Call today to learn more about the help we can give your family. Hospice of Texarkana, the nonprofit hospice established in 1985 for the community, by the community.
As things get older, they require more care. This car and I have seen a lot of miles together, but because I take care of her, she runs just like she did in 1955. That's why I chose the Wadley Senior Clinic with an individualized care plan designed just for me and a convenient location off Jefferson Avenue. They have everything to keep me running like new. It's not about the miles, it's about the journey. Let the Wadley Senior Clinic keep you happy, healthy, and cruising down the road of life.
From our first moments to our final days, life's journey should be remembered free of burden and worry. Families should be cherished. SEMA Hospice provides comfort care, dignity, and respect. Learn more about SEMA Hospice at SEMAHospice.com. SEMA Hospice, comfort and care when it matters most.
Welcome back to Aging Insight, everybody. I'm your host, John Ross. And today we're talking about some of the unique issues related to firearm possession. And you know, a lot of times people don't necessarily think elder law and firearms.
Right.
How in the world do those things go together? But you know, firearms are a very common asset. You know, in fact, I think in Texas there are more firearms in the state of Texas than there are people in the state of Texas. You know, so firearm ownership is very common. And yet it comes with its own set of rules that are different than anything else you have in your house. And so, you know, we started out by talking about, you know, if you become disabled, your own disabilities may prevent you from being in legal possession of a firearm, and those guns in your house may not be legally in your house because of circumstances that are beyond your control. And so you're going to have to plan for that. But even if that's not necessarily an issue, you know, when you die, these assets are going to go to other people. Mm-hmm. You know, you've got a will or something that says, I leave everything to my 3 kids, or maybe you've got a trust or whatever. But the same rules that affect your ownership affect the ownership of those guns once they pass at your death.
Well, that's right. You know, and so the heirs or beneficiaries of those firearms, they have to meet the same requirements as if they had gone out and purchased that firearm. So let me explain how this could impact your estate plan. You know, if it is your desire that your firearms are split between all your grandsons, for instance, something I've seen very commonly, but one of your grandsons is going through a nasty divorce, and his estranged spouse is alleging family violence or domestic abuse against that grandson, and maybe to keep everything as light as possible, he agreed to some sort of misdemeanor which involved the domestic violence, but there was only a little fine. There wasn't, and I'm not even saying the domestic violence charge is true or not. I'm just saying that if that grandson, reaches, some sort of agreement, says, yeah, I'll agree to plead to a misdemeanor so we can move past this. Well, now under federal law, that grandson cannot be in possession of a firearm. So if your estate plan is for those firearms, some firearm to go to that grandson, we've got a problem. Because now if you have an executor or trustee who's in charge of delivering the assets to the heirs, then, the grandson's mad at the executor. Then we also have, if the executor does deliver the firearm to that grandson, now we've got two family members who are in trouble, potentially big trouble. So it's really a minefield to navigate.
Yeah, and of course you may be saying, well, I'm not really worried about any of my kids or grandkids having convictions for domestic violence, and maybe so. But what if you're planning on everything going to that son, but that son dies before you, and so the guns that you intended to leave to him instead pass to his children, who are minors?
Right. Yeah. A very common situation.
Yeah. So, again, under the law, a 6-month-old cannot be in possession of that old Colt 45 that you brought back from the war. This is one of those situations where you could leave $1 to the 6-month-old, you could leave him a spoon, but you can't leave him a firearm. You've got to make provisions for what's going to happen if that firearm lands in the hands of a minor.
Well, and one of my favorite situations that we see come up is, families live so far apart from each other these days. So, what if your kids are great, they're stand-up kids, there's no problems, no drug issues, no mental health issues, no criminal issues, and you desire for your firearms to be split among your children, and one of those children lives in the state of Massachusetts. Now we have a problem, because while it may not be any big deal at all for your child who lives in Oklahoma or Arkansas or Arizona to, come by and pick up his part of the inheritance, if there's a firearm involved, there are many states that have very strict requirements on the possession of that firearm and transporting that firearm across state lines and into that state. So, we have to be very cautious if our beneficiaries live in less gun-friendly states than you do, because your inheritance could basically be confiscated by the state and get your child into severe criminal trouble if the transfer and transport of that firearm is not done correctly.
That's right. And on top of all of this, what we've been talking about are your regular firearms, your deer rifles, your handguns, but we haven't even talked about those specialty items. Now in Texas and Arkansas, you can hunt with a silenced weapon, a firearm that has a silencer on it. But there's even more rules that apply to those sort of things. Right. And so what we want to have is some tool that we can address these issues, like what happens if you're unable to manage your own affairs, what happens when you die and you pass assets to other people, and how do we address these circumstances? Well, there is a solution to it, but you're going to have to wait until we come back from this break. So we'll take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll see if we can solve some of these problems. Be right back.
With my dad, it was in a hospital setting, and in his situation, he fell into renal failure. He also helped us make the decision to be on hospice. I have to admit, it took a huge weight off our shoulders for him to be willing. That offered us a lot of comfort, along with the hospice company itself, but it gave us closure, and it helped us through the entire process.
SEMA Hospice, comfort and care when it matters most.
As things get older, they require more care. This car and I have seen a lot of miles together, but because I take care of her, she runs just like she did in 1955. That's why I chose the Wadley Senior Clinic with an individualized care plan designed just for me and a convenient location off Jefferson Avenue. They have everything to keep me running like new. It's not about the miles, it's about the journey. Let the Wadley Senior Clinic keep you happy, healthy, and cruising down the road of life.
Welcome back, everyone, to Aging Insight. I'm Lisa Scholmeyer, and I'm here with John Ross, and we're elder law attorneys and asset protection attorneys based right here in the Arklatex. And today we're talking about assets that are very special to lots of families, and those assets are firearms and a lot of the implements that go with firearms. And these assets not only represent a lot of monetary value to many families, but they're also really important sentimental assets in families. So we want to make sure that those assets are protected and remain within the family as the owner of those firearms desires. But there's lots and lots and lots of rules and regulations and, frankly, traps waiting to spring up when it comes to possessing firearms and passing firearms as part of an estate plan. And we've addressed a couple of those problems, including incapacity, criminal convictions, domestic violence, whether or not a beneficiary lives in a gun-friendly state. So, we've addressed a lot of problems, but let's talk about a solution. So, John, what would be your proposed solution to all these problems that we're laying out there for everyone?
Well, yeah, and of course, there's no one solution for anything, but probably one of the most common tools that we use in our practice is something called a gun trust. Mm-hmm. A lot of times when I say the word trust, people kind of think of like John D. Rockefeller and people with billions of dollars and all of that sort of thing. And all a trust is a tool. And it's a stack of paper, and that stack of paper has rules, and you can use that trust kind of like surgery. There's lots of different types of surgery. And whatever that particular problem you have is, there's a type of surgery that can be used to fix it. Well, a gun trust is a particular type of trust that's designed to address the particulars of gun ownership. And so, a gun trust would have provisions in it that, as long as I'm alive, I'm in control of it, and these are my firearms. But that if I become incapacitated, or particularly if I become so incapacitated that I'm declared unfit to manage my own affairs, like by the VA, that the trust document says, oh, well then, okay, John's no longer in possession of these, and a new trustee steps in, somebody I have appointed, and their job now is to hold those firearms until something happens to me.
Yeah, to hold those firearms pursuant to your wishes.
That's right, to hold them pursuant to my wishes, not give them away or anything like that.
Not take them down to the pawn shop.
Right, but
yeah.
They're to hold them presumably until my passing, at which point they're going to pass to my kids. And all of that's going to be in that trust document. But that trust document is going to say some other stuff about those kids.
Yeah, that trust document is likely going to address we don't know what the future holds for everybody, so we need to build in safety valves, if you want to think of it that way, to where if a child that is an heir to receive a firearm, if that child does have criminal entanglements or mental health issues or lives in a gun unfriendly state, that that trustee is given very specific instructions on how to hold the firearm for that child or that minor grandchild that may be a beneficiary. But there's rules and steps to take to make sure that those firearms remain as part of the family legacy and do not get anybody else in trouble. That the heir, if they're not a permitted gun owner because of whatever reason, we also don't want the trustee to get in trouble for withholding an asset or giving an asset when it's inappropriate. So we're going to put some rules in place about dealing with all of that.
That's right. And again, a trust is actually a legal entity. It's like a person itself. And because of that, it has its own set of rules. And so when you're dealing with very specialized items like silencers, fully automatic weapons, things like that, if those are owned by a gun trust, that can actually smooth the process of purchasing those by not having to go through quite so many hoops, but also it prevents any unintentional crimes. So for example, if I own a silencer that's registered to me individually, but I let my good friend Lisa take it out to the range and shoot it, well, I've just transferred a registered firearm to an unregistered person. Under the federal law, that's 20 years in prison and a $250,000 fine.
Yeah, and you were just, we were just...
And I'm just helping my buddy so he could go shoot my gun. Now, on the other hand, if that silencer or silenced weapon is owned by my gun trust, I could make Lisa a temporary beneficiary. And therefore, whether I'm in possession of it or she's in possession of it, I have not created a transfer because the gun trust is still the owner.
Yeah, that's right. The gun trust still owns the gun, and under the terms of that gun trust, then I am a permitted possessor of that silenced firearm for a temporary time period.
Yeah, and so this allows flexibility. It addresses my personal ownership issues as I get older, and then as I pass these assets to my kids, it addresses any issues they may have. So keep in mind that if you are a firearm owner, you've got a unique asset, and unique assets need unique planning.
That's right. A lot of our gun owners are very concerned about their freedom to own those firearms, and you need to plan for those firearms for your estate just as carefully as you have in your purchase and maintenance of those firearms during your life, because I'm sure what you don't want to happen is for those firearms to be confiscated or returned to a government agency when you work so hard to acquire them and enjoy them. So the gun trust is one solution.
That's right. Well, we've reached the end of another episode of Aging Insight. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for this week's Aging Insight program with John Ross and Lisa Scholmeyer. This program is made possible by